The optometrist is working, for example, with teachers. So what we would hope would happen if the optometrist is doing the whole job is that children with problems at school get referred to an optometrist who's specialised in this area. That's you after this course. The optometrist will look at whether the eyes are healthy as usual, they'll look for any refractive error as usual, they'll do a more detailed than usual workup of the binocular vision and the accommodation, and we're covering that tomorrow. And then they may look at eye movements and visual perceptual skills, and we're going to talk about that tomorrow because that's controversial. We're going to talk about coloured overlays today and how they can test for visual stress and whether they meet the modern criteria for visual stress, and if so, they'll be tested with the intuitive colorimeter. Now, increasingly in the UK, these tools that you're going to be using in the workshop today are used by teachers as well. So there's an alternative pathway where the teacher does the testing with the coloured overlays and then refers to the optometrist to check their side of things. But we would argue that teachers should refer all children to optometrists, not just those who want a coloured filter, because clearly we should look for the other things like refractive error, orthoptic anomalies, and so in coloured filters. So at the end of the special investigation, the eye exam plus, if you like, I think it's very useful to send a report to parents, and these days we send them a PDF, and they send that PDF on to the school. And it's very easy with modern word processing software to come up with a report that summarises your tests, that gives a plain English summary of what you found, and that has an appendix that explains what all the tests do. And again, if you want to download a template for this, you can download it from this website. The reason why this report is very useful, optometrists sometimes send this sort of report when they find a problem, but remember, 70–80% of the children we see won't have a problem. And I think it's just as important to send a report like this when everything's normal. Because why don't people refer every child to us? Why don't parents and teachers refer children who struggle to optometrists routinely? I think one of the main reasons is because they suspect that we want to sell them glasses, or we want to sell them vision therapy. We want to treat all of them, is what they're worried about. What is the best practice builder for us is when we have a successful case and the parents see the improvement, but it's also a very important practice builder when we send a report back to the school to say, I've checked the child, I don't think there's anything wrong with them visually. I think I've done my job, I've checked everything out, visually they're okay, they need to go further to the other people, the other healthcare professionals, education professionals that will help that child. Because then we're assuring the teachers that we're not overzealous, we're not trying to treat every child that we see. So I do this report in my practice, or a brief version of the report for every single child that I see for these workups. So conclusions. From this first talk, there are certain visual problems that we'll be talking about in the next 2 days that are associated with reading problems. We're going to talk about visual stress, sometimes called Mears-Erland syndrome, binocular instability, and accommodative insufficiency. All of these problems can cause similar symptoms, and these symptoms are eye strain, headaches, and visual perceptual distortions. So the optometrist has to do the job of differential diagnosis. And I should really stress this, that all of the conditions we're going to talk about, BV, accommodation problems, visual stress that's helped by coloured filters, they cause very similar symptoms. Teachers sometimes say, how will I know who needs coloured glasses? How will I know who needs vision therapy? How can I find that out? The only answer to that is you can retrain as an optometrist, because you can't ask the child any question that will tell you whether they've got one of those problems or not. So they need to detect those problems, those symptoms, and if the symptoms are present, they need to send them to you so that you can do the diagnostic testing that will tell you what the underlying problems are. Okay, so that's the first presentation. We're running on time, which is good. And the next presentation will be talking about the tools that we're going to be using in the workshops today. Any questions on that first presentation? Brilliant. Good. Okay, so let's go straight then into the second one. Good. So this is the tools that we use to check for the signs and benefit from coloured, the signs of visual stress and the benefit from coloured filters. So visual stress, the use of coloured filters for some children with learning problems actually goes back a very long time. How many of you have been to City University in London? There's one or
I'm
two.
visiting on the 24th.
Oh, okay, cool. If you go to City University, that area of London, just north of the City of London, Clerkenwell, is an area that if you went back to in the 1780s, it would have been in some respects quite similar to today, because the new thing then in London in that era were coffee shops. Coffee was quite new then, and the wealthy people would go to coffee shops. They would pay a lot of money for coffee, so just like Starbucks, and they would sit there and they would read novels. So it's remarkably similar to today, but when they read novels, the fashion then was to wear glasses like this, because people discovered that this new thing they were doing called reading, that the masses were doing for the first time, or at least the educated masses, this new thing often caused eye strain. And they found this eye strain was better with coloured glasses, particularly blue, green, turquoise coloured glasses. So in the 1780s, these plano tints were used to ease eye strain when reading. And then they fell into disuse, but then in 1958, a famous neurologist called MacDonald Critchley. In the UK, the best medical practitioners are those that do so by appointment to the royal family. And MacDonald Critchley was, in the last century, in the 1960s and 70s, he was the head of the neurology profession. He was the Queen's, the royal family's neurologist. He was also an expert on dyslexia. And he wrote a book on dyslexia where he described a case study that puzzled Jansky, an ophthalmologist who discovered this case. And this was a child who had dyslexic problems that was solved by reading on coloured card. And it was discovered by accident, and they scratched their head over why this child could read on coloured card and couldn't read on white card or white paper. And then in the 1980s, a New Zealand teacher called Olive Mears said, hey, I think this is a syndrome. She said there's a syndrome of eye strain and visual perceptual distortions. People reporting seeing shapes and blurring and movement on the page that some children with reading problems have, and they get it from text on a white background. And she said you can fix this for many of them by having a coloured background, maybe a grey background, or she discovered that using plastic acetates on the page helped. Now, in 1983, Helen Erlen said, I've discovered it. That's Americans for you. She said, I've discovered it, and she came up with a business model based on this. Her business model is Erlen Institutes, which I think are franchisee organisations, and there are Erlen Institutes throughout the world. Do you have them here in Israel?
Yes.
Yeah. And these Erlen Institutes are where people test for the benefit, test for what she calls Erlen syndrome, same thing, and they test for this with coloured sheets on the page. That's how they screen for it. They then test with coloured lenses, and they prescribe coloured lenses that I know in the UK are very expensive.
So here they're also expensive, but you wanted to say that here, I don't know how it is over there, it's not optometrists who do the OTs, it's all kinds of teachers.
Yeah, and in the UK it's not necessarily even teachers. You know, I know an Erlen screener who's got no professional qualifications whatsoever. He's not a teacher, he's not an OT, he's not an optometrist. He's been trained by Erlen, but he doesn't do it from any background. Yeah, absolutely. And they say people who are tested by the Erlen organisation are told to have an eye exam. But we all know that, what does that mean? You know, they might go to somebody and have a 10-minute sight test in a shop somewhere. So yeah, it is a worry. But she basically said the colours need to be very precisely defined. And she argued right from the start that if you get the colour slightly wrong, it won't work. Now, I don't think that's true in every case. In fact, I don't think that's true in most cases. In a few cases, I think it might be. But I think she was arguing that, in my personal view, for business reasons. Because that way she could say opticians and optometrists can't make up the colour glasses because they won't get the colour right. And we'll come back. That's why we've got this session today on tools, because there are some very good tools that will let you prescribe colour. The leading researcher in the UK is Professor Arnold Wilkins, who I first met when I was doing my PhD, and we've researched together for many years. He's one of the finest minds I've ever met, and a mentor to me. And he invented an instrument for testing colour and a whole range of equipment that's used by optometrists in the UK for testing visual stress. And these are the tools that we're using today. He carried out, led the first double-masked randomised controlled trial of children with reading difficulties. I was a co-worker in that study in 1994. It was published. He later did a similar study on migraine and vision. Since then, he's been researching a great deal about discomfort in natural cells and the underlying mechanism. We're trying to get a new big randomised controlled trial underway now because, as you'll hear tomorrow, we need to do a lot more research in this field. So what is this thing? Well, the first thing to say is it's had many names. Visual stress is the current name. Erlen initially called it scotopic sensitivity syndrome, that is a meaningless term. She then called it Erlen syndrome. I felt that was unfair because Mears first described it in detail, so I called it Mears-Erlen syndrome. Professor Wilkins called it visual stress. For a while it was called Mears-Erlen syndrome stroke visual stress. Now I like that because that makes up the acronym MIS-VIS for misvision or Mears-Erlen syndrome visual stress. The trouble with calling it visual stress, the reason I've always had a problem with visual stress is because optometry uses visual stress sometimes to describe a BV problem, don't we? A binocular vision problem. And so maybe we should call this sensory visual stress. As opposed to motor visual stress, which is what we mean by binocular vision problems. Anyway, it's called visual stress these days, and it is defined as two things. The presence of certain symptoms that are helped by using colour. But as you saw in that flow chart that I showed you just now, it really is a diagnosis of exclusion. Because before you reach the diagnosis of visual stress, you have to rule out other causes for these symptoms. You have to rule out binocular vision problems, refractive errors, accommodation problems, maybe eye movement problems, and so on. So what are the symptoms? Well, people say that words come out the page at them. Lovely this. Not quite like this, but it's gorgeous, isn't it?
Yeah.
But they really describe words blurring and moving and jumbling on the page. And the benefit from colour is nothing new. This is an advert from the 1940s in an American optometric journal for coloured glasses, coloured lenses to help people using a typewriter. But nowadays we can do a lot better than we could do then, and much, much better than we could do 300 years ago, because nowadays we use CR39 instead of glass. And with CR39 we can dye colours very easily in a variety of colours. So let's do a controlled experiment, but not terribly scientific. If you look at the two halves and ask yourself whether you find one half more comfortable or easier to read than the other.
The left.
Okay, the left. And I'm going to show you several of these now. And then I'll show you a third one. So for each of these, ask yourself whether one half makes the text look better or worse than the other. First of all, did any of you find that any of those colours made it harder to read and less comfortable?
Yes.
Yep.
Yellow.
Did any of you find that any of those colours made it easier to read and more comfortable?
The yellow.
Okay,
Yellow.
so the yellow helped for some. Did for anyone the yellow make it worse? Okay. Who else found a colour helpful? Anyone find any other colours other than yellow helpful?
Yes, the blue.
The blue, yep. Anyone find blue made it worse? Oh, okay, one or two. So there you go. You've just described maybe Erlen syndrome. And it's bizarre that sometimes colours help, sometimes colours make it worse, and it seems to be individual. But for most people, we think now that visual stress is on a continuum. For some people have no visual stress. You show them colours and they say, well, it looks coloured, but it doesn't look any easier to read. Other people, you show them text like this, and almost as soon as they look at it, it blurs and moves. And when you get the colour right, they say it stops it blurring and moving. And if you change the colour a bit, the blurring and moving comes back. It really is quite strange. But for that, what I've just described is the most severe degree of visual stress. And that, I think, is actually very rare. Most people are on the continuum between no visual stress and severe visual stress. And for most of us, it's something that we can notice, but it's not going to make a big difference to us. And it's just interesting to research. But for a few people, it can be, I think, a big issue. But the first thing to say is, if you're going to ask why might some people find colour helpful, well, it may be a non-genuine reason. It may be because it's their favourite colour, particularly if they're a child. It may be because of a placebo effect. If a child's struggling at school to read, and you put a colour on the page that makes it look different, and you say, does this help? Well, some are just going to find that you're suggesting it helps, and therefore it does help, a big placebo effect. So the question is not, is it a placebo? Because it will be a placebo. We can't help that. As soon as you give any child glasses, vision therapy, colour, we're giving them a placebo, even if we don't want to. So the question is it just a placebo, or is there a genuine treatment effect in addition to a placebo effect? And we're going to talk tomorrow afternoon about the research underlying this, and it's a controversial area, I'll tell you that now. There's research supporting the use of colour, and there's people that say, I don't believe that research, and I'm going to talk about both viewpoints tomorrow. But really, what we've been arguing for a long time is that we should have an open mind here, and we should ask the children what they see. So, Professor Wilkins, this is Arnold Wilkins over here. He's a very modest guy. Whenever you see him with his research team, he's always at the back of the picture. But he argued that we should really take a scientific approach. And when Erlen first started making these claims in the 1980s, many in the UK just dismissed them, said there can't be anything in them, they just sound ridiculous. And Arnold Wilkins said, no, let's think about what she's saying, and let's think about it in terms of colour science. So we know that we can see colours that are not on the rainbow. We can discriminate better than the rainbow. And the last talk of this course from my son on Thursday that you'll have is about colour vision. We know that we have three sorts of cones, and that's why we can see colour in 3 dimensions rather than 2. We have a blue cone, green and red, and these cones mean that our colour perception is defined with a triangle. And I don't know about you, but I always had trouble with these lectures when I was an undergraduate. But the way the chromaticity diagram works is that white is in the centre. As you go further out from the centre, you go to more saturated colours. And as you go round in a circle, you keep the saturation the same, but you change the hue. And every colour the human eye can perceive is on this diagram. Now, my son on Thursday is going to talk about the XY diagram. I'm talking about the U-V' diagram. What's the difference? They look similar, they are similar. The difference, though, is that this is scaled roughly according to visual perception. So the way this works is that a difference between the 2 colours here of a given amount is a similar perceptual difference to between 2 colours up there. They're different colours, but they're about equally different. And what Professor Arnold Wilkins did was he said, let's think about Erlen's claims. Let's think about what she's really saying. And what Erlen was saying was that somebody with visual stress gets these symptoms when they look at text, unless they look at text with a particular colour. Now, the first thing he said is she's got to be wrong. The reason she's got to be wrong, because she said it's a point, it's an infinitely small point, it's got to be exactly the right colour. That's got to be wrong because otherwise the tints wouldn't work under different sorts of lighting. If you drew the curtains and you looked at the page with daylight, with a white light, it's different to the colour of these lights, it's different to the colour of an incandescent bulb, and so on and so on. So she can't be right. What she must really mean, to give her a bit of flexibility, is that there's a circle, a small locus for each person where colour's helpful, and if you move away from that colour, it won't be helpful. So what we needed to research this was an instrument that would let us explore colour space. And that's what Professor Wilkins invented with the intuitive colorimeter. And I'll talk more about that in a moment, but I think the two main systems are the Erlen one and the Wilkins one. Both of them have some similarities. Both of them let you screen for the presence of the condition using coloured overlays, and we'll be doing that later. Both of them have a very large range of colours. With the Wilkins system, he developed a special reading test to validate the benefit from colour. The other thing that Arnold Wilkins did was when he developed his system, he developed it using dyes that have a broad transmission curve. And that, excuse me? Yeah.
What is overlays?
Yeah, they're coloured transparencies that you place on the page.
It's a filter?
Yeah, it's a filter. So it's, I can show you. Yeah, it's something like this. So various colours, different colour sheets that you place on the page like that. And I'll show you those a bit later. But they're used to screen for the condition, and then the colorimeter is used to test for the condition. But the key point with this is both the systems really have similar features, although the Wilkins system has been published in scientific journals so that anyone can evaluate it. Erlen's system is more secret, it's proprietorial, it's less widely accessible. And the other difference is, and this lady at the back made this point, Erlen's system is not practiced by eye care professionals, the Wilkins system is. The intuitive colorimeter is used by optometrists, orthoptists, and 1 or 2 ophthalmologists. It's also used in the UK by some neurologists as well. But it's used by healthcare professionals, Erlen's system isn't. And the research we're going to talk about tomorrow. There are other approaches that are used. Photosyntonics. Anyone do photosyntonics here? No. Okay, it's a behavioural optometry extreme practice in my view. Not many behavioural optometrists do it. It's where you look at a light filter, and it's bizarre, to be honest. You know the light boxes that are used in seasonal affective disorder to try and treat depression? So you have a light box, like an old X-ray viewing box, a light box, and you put coloured filters on it, and the child just sits and looks at it. And these people who believe in photosyntonics argues that that recalibrates the autonomic nervous system, whatever that means. And it's been claimed that this treats myopia, migraine, virtually everything. It's a bizarre claim, and that's hardly ever used nowadays, so that's completely different. This is another system in the UK that's used by a few optometrists. That one isn't used anymore. So let's concentrate now on what we're going to be using today, which is the Wilkins system, the intuitive colorimeter. Now this is at the end of the system, and so we're going to do it slightly in reverse. We're going to talk about what happens if somebody wants coloured glasses, and then we're going to talk about how people are screened with these coloured overlays. So this is what the intuitive colorimeter looks like. It's a box. If it was on this table, it's about that high, about that long. And the child looks in through a window here. The child's head goes here. The optometrists adjust these controls. And the child looks in through a window at a page of text. And that page of text is illuminated with light, and these controls are adjusted by the optometrist to change the colour of that light. And the way those controls work, the way the colour is changed, is to explore human colour space within the triangle of human colour perception. So you have three controls here. One control changes the hue, so it goes around in a circle. This control here, that one, changes the saturation, the depth of colour. And the third control, just up here, changes the brightness. It's got a very large gamut of colours, and you can independently vary hue, saturation and brightness. Now, a key thing with this test is the person remains colour adapted. So I showed you these coloured sheets here earlier, which are the coloured overlays that we're going to talk about later. With those coloured overlays, the patient is only partly colour adapted. When they look through lenses, or when they look at the intuitive colorimeter through this window, they are fully colour adapted. And we'll come back to that a bit later. So the colorimeter we have here in Hadassah is a Mark II colorimeter. If you're interested in how it works, the way it works is you have a fluorescent tube inside the instrument, which is a special tube designed to be daylight type of tube. That tube is inside a cylinder, and that cylinder is divided into two halves. A half that has coloured filters, and a half that has grey. And what happens is the light from the fluorescent light shines through a window inside the instrument, and this is then scattered, the light that comes through. Now, that window is about the width of one sector of colour on this colour wheel. If the light shines exclusively through the yellow, then it will be pure yellow. If you turn the wheel around slightly so that light is shining through the yellow and a tiny bit of the green, then it's slightly yellowy green. If you keep turning it, eventually you get to a pure lime green. If you keep turning it, then you get to a pure mint green, and so on. And so by turning it small amount,